New Orleans dockyard, summer 1943. The ship screamed as it moored, steel cables groaning against the bollards. The men on deck sunburned, silent, each carrying the ghost dust of North Africa on their uniforms, waited for orders. Most had not seen the horizon beyond that railing in 3 weeks. Now they stared across rows of cranes and cargo nets where a banner fluttered in the heat. Port of embarkation, U.S. Army Transport Service. A corporal counted them quicker than anyone could understand English numbers. Off the gangway! Schnell! The German prisoners obeyed. Gray uniforms bleached to khaki, boots splitting from salt and sun. They clutched small bundles marked with chalk initials, brushes, postcards, a razor, everything life had shrunk to. As they filed down the ramp, the smell struck first. Hot tar, diesel exhaust, and coffee. Yes, coffee, that impossible luxury. On the pier, a group of American MPs waited, sleeves rolled high, rifles low, more curious than hostile. One joked to another, "Well, look at 'em, Cap." "First Nazis I ever saw. Aren't they just boys?" The prisoners avoided eye contact. Their officers had promised medieval vengeance chains and whips in the enemy's homeland. Back home, posters had called America the land of mechanical monsters and racial chaos. Texans, they believed, shot prisoners for sport. Through the slow heat, they walked toward waiting boxcars labeled USA RMYTRANSPORT. Their destination was vague. Camp Unknown Texas Sector. The word alone felt like sentence enough. Texas desert, snakes, lynchings, and crosses on fire. Hell under a flag of stars. Hours later, the train lurched north from the Gulf, crossing from green humidity into the long open plains where horizon melted into sky. One man, Corporal Keller, wiped condensation from the grimy window and whispered to the next, "Schon die Hölle already, hell." By the second day, it stopped feeling like punishment. The guards passed out sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. A private shared a cigarette without ceremony. Outside, pecan trees shimmered hard silver in sunlight. Then they saw it. A cotton field line after blinding white lines stretching toward a water tower painted Bryan, Texas. A few raised eyebrows. "Is that for us?" someone murmured. The trucks waited beside the siding, throwing chalk-white dust as they started up. Locals gathered to watch the convoy. A boy on a bicycle pedaled beside them, shouting, "Howdy, Jerry's," half threat, half welcome. Behind him, an old ranch wife waved from her porch as though greeting lost nephews. Colonel Hollis Whitmore met them at the camp gate, a stocky man with polite fatigue in his eyes. He spoke slowly, loud enough for the interpreter to follow. "You're in the care of the U.S. Army. You'll be treated according to the Geneva Convention. Behave, work, and you'll eat better than you expect." The prisoners stood rigid, dust settling on their caps. Somewhere, a rooster crowed. Then Whitmore added, almost smiling, "Welcome to Texas, gentlemen." They looked past him toward the interior, rows of new pine barracks, screen door hinges shining, a canteen stocked with tinned peaches, irrigation ditches feeding a garden neat as parade grounds. Beyond the inner fence, horses grazed under shade as if the war had never been invented. That night the men lay muttering under clean cotton sheets, ceiling fan ticking overhead. A thunderstorm rolled across the plains, drumming a rhythm older than politics. After months of defeat and captivity, sleep came fast. Keller wrote in his new U.S. Army-issued journal, "We feared hell. We found campfire light by sunrise. The panic had thinned into disbelief." Kitchen aromas wafted across the yard pancakes, real syrup, percolating coffee. Guards handed out mugs the prisoners learned to call G.I. Joe. The taste burned sweet. Expectation demanded humiliation. Reality offered breakfast. Sergeant Reeves watched them eat. "Strangest damn thing," he whispered to another guard. "They look relieved." When flag-raising came at 8, There was no defiance, only curiosity blue eyes following the fabric's climb against a cloudless sky. And that's where the contradiction took shape, before anyone had time to define friendship or treason. German captives, expecting unending misery, were about to discover that Texas could wound only with its sun. Everything else it offered felt dangerously close to kindness. Camp Hearn looked like a small town pretending to be a prison. By mid-1943, every barrack smelled of pine resin and disinfectant. Beds aligned tight enough to impress an architect. Footlockers shined under ration lamps. Outside, softball diamonds dusted the open yard, garden rows stretched behind the mess hall, and a water tower loomed over everything with the confidence of plenty. To the new arrivals, discipline was familiar. Order had built their army and would now, apparently, build their exile. But the tone was different. Guards shouted for efficiency, not cruelty. "Morning head count?" And then, without sarcasm, "Danke, Corporal." The courtesy confused its recipients more than any insult could have. Each day began before sunrise. The bugle ripped the dark, and crows answered back. Prisoners stumbled into the chill, boots crunching gravel, breath turning to steam that faded as quickly as fear. Breakfast lines formed, pancakes, oatmeal, sometimes bacon. The smell drifted to the guard's station where a sergeant joked, "Hell, our food's worse than theirs." For the first few weeks, the camp lived by suspicion. Would kindness collapse once boredom set in? Would the rumors of abuse from other fronts crash through these fences? But Texas had its own momentum. The state was short on hands and long on work. And work, the colonel believed, was the cure for anything. Each morning, convoys of open trucks waited by the gate. Groups of 10 prisoners climbed aboard under watch of a single-armed guard. They rode past cotton fields, windmills, ice houses, a moving picture of a countryside untouched by bombs. Their job: pick, mend, haul, thresh, save harvests threatened by the manpower drain. In the beginning, farmers refused eye contact. "Let the Jerrys sweat," one said flatly, but sweat has no accent. By the third week, locals were teaching the prisoners how to balance hay bales on pitchforks, how to ride fence line, how to cuss at cows in English. The men learned quickly. They were disciplined, strong, and desperate to feel useful. Payment arrived in the form of script paper rations, redeemable only inside camp canteens, but dignity came free with the Texas morning heat. For men who'd spent months crawling in desert trenches, the ranch openness felt merciful. Evenings were quieter. Guards leaned against fence posts, while prisoners played soccer in a storm of dust. The field lights glowed dim orange through gnats. Some nights, violin notes rose from a barrack, turning prairie air into a ballroom as distant as Europe. Americans walking perimeter shifts stopped to listen, embarrassed by how beautiful it sounded. Humanity seeped through regulations like rain through canvas. The camp had rules against fraternization, but country folk considered friendliness a civic duty. Truck drivers dropped tobacco pouches as accidents. A teacher from town mailed English textbooks anonymously. At Christmas, the Lutheran Church left boxes of oranges and hymnals by the main gate. Guards pretended not to notice when the men sang Silent Night in 2 languages simultaneously. Letters trickled in from Germany with censors' stamps like blood seals. One soldier read aloud, "Mother sends rain and dreams." Another traced the newsprint of a bombing in Hamburg and closed his eyes. The ache of that knowledge hardened and gentled at once. Their war had shrunk to these fences. Here, they could build something as mundane and miraculous as normalcy. Inside the wire, they created a miniature world, a tailor shop fashioning coats from flour sacks, a bakery that traded rye loaves for guardhouse coffee, a school offering English at night. Each barrack a small republic of former enemies, learning exhaustion together. Some POWs tested boundaries subtly. A carved figurine handed to a child through the fence, sketches of ranches mailed secretly to families back home. Guards confiscated few. They preferred peace to paperwork. Only when the newspaper reporters arrived did anxiety return. Headquarters loved production statistics but frowned at smiling photographs. Too much decency, it seemed, spoiled the narrative. Yet decency persisted. The Camp Baseball League grew famous. Texans versus Germans. The scoreboard scribbled in 2 languages. When the prisoners lost, they saluted the victors with applause, genuine enough to unsettle American pride. "Don't feel right," one spectator admitted. "Supposed to beat 'em at everything, not just games." The fences still carved silhouettes against dawn and sunset, but their meaning thinned. The barbs grew dull under recurring dust storms. Men on both sides stopped flinching when wind rattled the wire. Prison had become, if not paradise, something survivable, decent, almost tender in its absurd humanity. The Germans had come expecting hell. Instead, they were slowly being tamed by hospitality. When a reporter later asked Sergeant Reeves what the difference was between this camp and others he'd heard about, the Texan answered simply, "We got manners. Guess that's our secret weapon." By early 1944, the camp breathed like a well-run ranch. The guards cycled shifts, the prisoners ran everything else. They baked, printed leaflets, dug ditches, stitched uniforms, harvested cotton, all to the rhythm of the Texas sun. The joke among overseers went, "We could lock the gates and they'd still show up for work on time." Yet something deeper was happening, the strange chemical reaction between enemy and environment. Texas transformed the men faster than regulations could track. On windless afternoons, the POWs gathered by the fences to sketch longhorn cattle chewing indifferently on dust. A young artist named Kurt Bescher used charcoal from the mess stove, mapping the identical broad plains that once haunted him. "This place," he wrote in his notebook, "is too empty to hate us." The guard's suspicion softened through routine. Lieutenant Harlan Dix kept a blunt pencil behind his ear and a phrase on repeat. "If we treat 'em like men, maybe they'll act like it." He was right. When new batches of prisoners arrived from Europe skeletal from the Atlantic Transit, the older hands showed them rules of American captivity, how to ask for seconds, what slang to avoid, when to tip your hat. A subculture of politeness blossomed mid-prairie. At night, floodlights painted the wire white. Beyond it shimmered the faint glow of farmhouses. Some Germans swore they could smell roasting corn drifting through the wind. It reminded them disturbingly of home. A few miles away, locals had stopped whispering about the Nazis and started calling them the boys. When truckloads passed on county roads, children waved instead of saluting. One girl tossed a peach into the truck bed. The POW who caught it peeled it carefully and shared it down the row. It was such a simple act that neither side forgot it. The Army noticed. Memos warned, excessive cordiality breeds security risks. But Texas hospitality kept erasing risk by reflex. The first real friendship broke rules entirely. A rancher named Bill Duggan loaned his harmonica sample to a prisoner who had played professionally before the war. When the man returned it, polished spotless, the rancher grinned. "Keep it. You play prettier than I do week by week." These small gestures folded into something resembling belonging. By spring, the camp hosted joint work projects with local farms, mechanical repairs, veterinary help, masonry lessons. The degree of trust worried headquarters but delighted everyone else. One inspection report concluded, morale, outstanding. Too outstanding. Then came the day the contradiction went public. An Army photographer visited to document agricultural productivity. He snapped a frame without thinking. 3 smiling prisoners leaning on pitchforks beside a Texan farmhand, all squinting against the sun like cousins at harvest. When that photo appeared in the Dallas Morning News under the headline, "Enemies Help Texas Grow," letters of outrage poured into Washington. War without hatred frightened bureaucrats more than defeat. The camp commandant was reprimanded politely. Fewer photographers were allowed inside. But the story, once printed, refused to die. It traveled along gossip lines through churches and cafes. Those Germans ain't half bad. Around Easter, the chaplain convinced his superiors to permit a joint service. Rain tapped lightly on tin roofs as Americans and Germans sang together. A guard reported the irony. They sang "A Mighty Fortress Is Our God," sounded like home both ways. By midsummer, an even stranger scene arrived. When a flash flood tore a breach through the outer fence, 30 prisoners could have walked free into the rain-blurred night. Instead, they woke the guards. "Your wire is broken," one apologized. They spent the dawn helping repair it, shirtless in mud, laughing at the absurdity. No one up the chain knew how to file the report. Back in Germany, bombs carved cities into ghosts. Here in Texas, their sons stacked hay and rescued cattle from rising water. The contrast split the heart of every letter they wrote home. Erhard Mehnert, once a panzer lieutenant, described it perfectly. "Imagine being beaten and fed by the same hand. It tames something inside you didn't know was wild." Even within confinement, freedom practiced itself. The men founded a school, painted murals, wrote plays where Germans portrayed Americans, and switched accents mid-sentence to the audience's delight. Guards caught themselves clapping. A sergeant joked, "If we keep this up, we'll be sending these fellows home as Rotarians." Not everything was gentle. Ideological arguments flared. Some POWs held their allegiance tighter than comfort. Propaganda leaflets smuggled in by mail reignited tensions until fellow prisoners tore them down. But even that anger sounded more like debate than rebellion. Mini-climax came one night in December 1944. News crackled over the radio, the Battle of the Bulge. Snow fell quietly across the barracks roof, a rare Texas winter. The men listened in silence. Hours later, their foreman found the camp flagpole lowered halfway without orders. The Germans had done it for the Allied dead. Nobody reprimanded them. Nobody spoke for a long time. After that night, animosity as a concept seemed outdated. Prison routines remained, but spirit had wandered beyond paperwork. They had arrived expecting punishment. What they found instead was a kind of unasked-for redemption. A final reversal came when mail from across the Atlantic revealed how cities like Hamburg lay in ruins. In that moment, the prisoners realized that the fences around them protected more than confined. They preserved. Texas, the imagined hell, had become a living time capsule of what peace once felt like. The last winter of the war arrived without drama, no riots, no escapes, no hunger. Just boredom laced with melancholy. The men of Camp Hearn had become efficient at captivity. They tracked days the way farmers track weather. When peace finally came, it landed not like a trumpet, but a letter, typed, dry, factual, release schedule to begin for German POWs in theater of operations. That night, a kind of grief crept through the barracks. Home stood a word away, but few still recognized what home meant. They had learned English words for comfort coffee pot, sausage grinder, porch light, yet forgotten how to picture their own surviving street corners. The guards sensed it too. By May 1945, discipline turned symbolic. No one had the heart for hostility. Baseball continued. The teams played one final game, Germans in patched uniforms versus Americans in faded khaki. When the ninth inning ended, both sides tossed gloves into the same heap, a gesture too casual for history books, yet large enough to hold redemption. Weeks later, troop trucks lined the highway to collect the first repatriates. Before departure, each prisoner received a paper certificate stamped with eagle and stars. Served honorably in labor service to the United States. They carried it like talisman. At the gate, they shook hands with guards who had become friends. One MP handed a German corporal his worn copy of the Saturday Evening Post, folded to a Norman Rockwell cover. "Something to remember us by," he said. The convoy rolled away under the whine of southern cicadas and the smell of fuel. Locals stood on porches waving, as if seeing off neighbors rather than enemies. The trucks vanished into the flat horizon of Highway 21, the same road where their first day of fear had begun. A few weeks later, railroad boxcars waited in New Orleans. They stood heavy with luggage that rattled more with handmade gifts than contraband, a carved longhorn, a hand-stitched Texas flag, a jar of chili powder wrapped in paper labeled "Do Not Forget." When the ships pulled away, the sea carried thousands of men home to a Europe they no longer recognized. Letters began trickling back within months. Postmarks from Bremen, Cologne, Stuttgart. One read, "We left America, but Texas did not leave us." Another, "When we planted our first crops again, we remembered your son." Some arrived addressed to guards by name, others to entire towns. The mayor of Hearne kept one framed on his wall. "Thank you for not hating us when everyone else did." For years afterward, bits of connection lingered quietly. A package of homemade soap mailed each December from Bavaria to a ranch family in Rosenberg. A photograph of a rebuilt bakery captioned, "Modeled after the camp kitchen." And occasionally a visitor bearing unfamiliar cadence in his English asking, "Is the old water tower still standing?" Not everyone approved of the gentleness. Some war veterans wrote to newspapers calling it coddling. But the people who'd lived with the reality knew better. Mercy, they said, had cost them nothing and saved them from a harder kind of scar. Even the guards spoke of the Germans as a mirror. "They showed us we could win without being mean," one explained. Time carried the story outward, polishing details into legend. Children of both sides grew up hearing about the barbed wire neighbors who sent thank-you letters. School teachers began using the camp as a lesson about decency, and when the local museum finally curated its small display, one rusted fork, a POW wood carving of a cowboy, a hand-drawn map of Texas, the placard read, "Enemies learned hospitality here." Decades later, a reunion came quietly. It was 1971. A tour bus pulled into the empty field where Camp Hearne had been. Inside were 20 men with European accents softened by age. They stepped onto the red soil, hands trembling slightly as if greeting an old friend. One knelt, scooping a fistful of dirt into a tin. He whispered, "Warm, we damnels warm just like then." Their guide, a retired sergeant once posted here, watched in silence. When asked what he thought seeing them again, he said, "Some wars end late. This one ended today." The transformation was complete. The men who had dreaded American cruelty returned decades later to find only the embrace of memory. Texas had forgiven them long before they realized they needed forgiving. Now only foundations remain, slabs of cracked concrete, half swallowed by weeds. Crickets sing where searchlights once swept. From the hilltop the horizon widens the way it always has, limitless, indifferent, beautiful. Dusk lays gold over grass. It could be 1943 again for a flicker. To stand there is to feel the same uneasy question the prisoners once faced. Why was it so easy to hate a people you'd never met and so hard to keep hating once you'd shared bread with them? The air smells of clay and sun-baked cedar. The fences are gone, but when wind cuts through the residual strands of rusted wire lying in the grass, it sings a thin metallic note that sounds eerily like laughter. Because on this soil, enemies once found a strange sort of home.